news. So there is really, right now, a really big gap between the local and the global, the subject of our talk right now. So how do we bridge those gaps? How do we include more others that are not part of the negotiations? I've had the pleasure to be inside negotiating all the way from Copenhagen in 2009 to Paris in 2015. And the thing I fear the most is that the gap between the public and the negotiations rooms has not really decreased that much. But if you see and I would like to hear more your thoughts on this, but the protests and the signs of the protests, like we welcome climate criminals and stuff, the language is growing more polarizing between the negotiators that are slow. We are turtles. We're so slow. I love turtles, so turtles is not a good analogy, actually. Even when there's a spirit of optimism in the room, we're still moving very slowly. That injection of acceleration is really hard to get in a negotiation room where you're just so used to playing the game of negotiation. You move 1 inch, and then the other side moves you back an inch, and you move 1 inch, and so it's so slow. So how do you force the political system to move at a pace that's faster than we've never done before? We've never moved at the pace and at the scale that is needed for climate. So we do need you in a massive scale, not only protesting, but also at the table, and we haven't figured that out. We haven't figured out that balance between the negotiators and the public. So the good news is that before the climate, the COP was just process. When I started, it was really mainly process. Now the COP is an event and a process. So the space is opening up, but we're not there yet. There's still a long way to go because climate needs to be an issue for all of us and for everyone. So thank you.
Thank you, Jimena. It's very nice to hear also the perspective from someone who was negotiating in the past, and we'll have some follow-up questions for you. Now I would like to invite Mayara, who I was so worried about saying the last name correctly that I forgot mentioning. She's a co-founder and a program director at Plataforma Cipó, which recently launched a report with Together First on the topic of civil society access to global climate decision-making processes with the perspective from Global South activists. So what were the key findings of these reports, and what you identified as the main obstacles?
Thank you, Giovanna, for your question. Before I answer, I would like to thank the UNA-UK in the person of Anissa here for the invite, Global Challenge Foundation as well, and the School of Social and Political Sciences of the University of Glasgow. It's a pleasure to be here. So in terms of the report, this is a collaboration between my organization, Plataforma Cipó, which is a Brazilian think tank working on climate governance and peace building in Latin America, and Together First, who has already been set here. It's a global network of individuals and organizations who advocate for more effective and inclusive global governance. So our report, which is being written by Adriana, my colleague who is also a co-founder who is here, and Naifa, who is not here, but I'm sure she's watching us. The report came in a timely moment, but sadly for the wrong reasons. I'm sure you've all seen and probably heard in the news that COP26 has been defined as the whitest and most privileged COP ever. So in addition to documenting these challenges that have led to the exclusion of thousands of activists in the Global South at this COP in particular, the report also looks beyond that and looks a bit around the structural problems that have historically imposed barriers to an effective participation in UN climate processes. And then we go on after to talk a little bit about recommendations on what can be done to change this situation. So in terms of the long-standing hurdles that we documented in the report, the first one is an obvious one, which relates to the financial barriers. In other words, a lot of civil society organizations in the Global South in particular, they often lack the funding to physically attend those conferences, and of course that reduces their ability to influence the negotiation outcomes. This year, we all know everything has been even more difficult due to the COVID-19 situation, and in particular the unequal access to vaccines in the Global South, the changing rules around travel, what has been described the accommodation crisis, that we all know the prices have skyrocketed, there wasn't much availability, and that became cost prohibitive for a lot of our colleagues coming from Brazil, Latin America, Africa, and in other parts of the world. So another problem also relates to accreditation. This year has been particularly difficult, but it's always been a problem within the UN system. For COPs conference in particular, the UNFCCC, which is the main body tasked with dealing with climate change within the UN, they have their own accreditation process, whereby before being able to apply to participate in any of climate conference and COPs in particular, you need to have a status, an observer status before the Conference of Parties. And this, I'm sure a lot of you have probably gone through this process. It's not that easy, it's quite bureaucratic, it's slow, it can take 2 to 3 years to finalize. And this again tends to favor better resources NGOs in the North who are better equipped to deal with this informational language and technical challenges associated with this accreditation process. So I think the latest data that I could find was from 2017, but I think it's something around 2/3 of organizations with an observer status with UNFCCC come from developed nations. So there's still a big gap in terms of North and South divide. And so in addition to these financial barriers and bureaucratic barriers, there are some challenges that are more country specific. While some countries like Canada, Malawi, certain countries in Central and Latin America allow civil society organizations to become part of their official delegations, other states deny and restrict their participation, especially when they feel like the vision of global society somehow challenges the official position of governments, but which is a misunderstanding of our role. Of course, our role is not to validate official position, it's precisely to challenge it, but this often leads to exclusion. My own country, for instance, since 2019, civil society organizations are not allowed as part of the official delegation. To the contrary, they are being intimidated by Brazilian officials. In 2019 in Brazil, there was also widely reported that the government sent our intelligence agency to spy on organizations who were critical of the government. This year we are saying the same thing at COP. Some of the indigenous leaders have been intimidated again by those there at COP, and also by our president, which is not here in person, but he made use of his social medias to intimidate activists here, and some of those are now receiving life threats. So this is something that it's quite important to highlight, the challenges that environmental defenders are facing. It's not a coincidence that last year we had a record in murders of environmentalists, more than 200, I think 277 people murdered just because they defend the environment. So in a nutshell, those were some of the challenges that I was able to highlight here, but I invite you to go to Plataforma Cipol's website and UNA-UK's website and read the full report, and you can have a look at the other challenges that we discussed there as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayara, for bringing this perspective. I think we are all very privileged to be here in Glasgow, following close the COP, and I'm very glad that I have here with me 2 women from Latin America. So let's go to Christian. So let's talk a bit about international law. We can see examples, or even local legislature, being often more ambitious than global norms. So what do you think are the obstacles for scaling up such laws, and how can international lawmakers learn from that progress?
Thank you, Giovanna. Thank you also to the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here and to share a panel with all of you. Now you ask us, your question points us really to the tension between the local and the global, of course. And I mean, the starting point is one which I entirely share, that at the local level and at the domestic level, we have many ambitious laws, and we see climate pledges, principled acceptances translated into real, concrete, enforceable action. And that is exactly, of course, what at the global level is not yet accomplished. Now, my perspective as an international lawyer would be to say that this is often the case. I mean, I don't think this is particular to climate change. If you speak to human rights lawyers, if you speak to refugee lawyers, you often have the case that at the local level, at the domestic level, you have ambitious legislative projects, ambitious court decisions, and that is not a consensus that can be translated at the global level. So in that respect, I would say, while the challenges are different and not all of the issues that my co-panelists have just spoken to can be replicated, I think in terms of this method of scaling up, we face a common challenge. Now, and I think the reason is pretty plain and obvious. I mean, at the local domestic level, it may be that states are pressured into action, or it may be that environmentally conscious governments are pursuing ambitious legislative agendas. But at the international level, we're dealing with international law that has to be agreed between roughly 200 state parties. So it's much more difficult to reach consensus among them. And as I said, that's relatively irrespective of the topic. International law is always then, I think, the slow turtle, Jimena, and your example that you didn't then in the end like so much. But that's often the case. Now, what can we learn was your question. So it's not all gloom and doom, Giovanna. I think what we can learn from the successful examples of domestic mobilization for action is two things, I think, and two strategies can be co-opted. At the domestic level, it's hardly ever top-down, the enlightened vision of a president or a prime minister or environmental minister that results in action. It's a response to pressure and societal demands. So that is the obvious thing, which we're perhaps seeing in a nutshell, societal pressure at the global level now being made felt at COP26, which, as has been said, is an event and not just a process, even though we would want more connection to it. So one is mobilization of societal groups and pressure groups and activism of the sort that many of you are engaged in. The other thing which I would speak to perhaps as a lawyer in a more focused sense, which is I think particular, is using domestic courts and international courts as amplifiers. And that's something that's surprisingly successful in this otherwise often frustrating quest for effective climate change mitigation action that we're seeing in many countries now, relatively bold and forward-looking court decisions which are going where states perhaps not yet go as a group. So who are translating national NDCs, if you want, into concrete enforceable proposals. And I think it's not without reason, and for good reason, in fact, that exactly those strategies are now being contemplated at the international level, with attempts to seek advisory opinions from international courts, with increased reliance on strategic climate change litigation. I think that is a strategy that we can duplicate and perhaps scale up from the domestic experience that in some cases has been positive. Many thanks.
Thank you, Christian. So now let's discuss what comes after COP. How can we keep faith in the international processes when they seem to keep failing short, and how we can keep the 1.5 degree target? So let me go to you again, Jimena. So you were talking about the disconnection between the public here and what the public here and the negotiations going on. So you mentioned before you were also a seasoned negotiator, and you also work across the UN in New York. So how do you think like these international conferences and summits can work together, because we have so many? We have COP, we have Stockholm Plus 50, we have the Summit of the Future. So how can these things work together?
Thank you. In reality, sometimes they don't, right? To be very honest. But COP, I don't think COP's failing. It's not advancing at the pace we wanted, but it's not failing. I think there is political will to advance on this topic. But if you think about, let's use an example of a chocolate cake. There's only one chocolate cake left in the world, right? And there's this big chocolate cake. In Paris, we decided how we were going to cut it. And the decision was that each of us, let's say each of you is a country, each of us was going to say how much of that cake you want. That's like the carbon budget that we have. It's a problem because all of us would want a really big piece of cake if it's the last cake you'll have, correct? And so, and there's no referee, there's no one cutting the cake, there's really no monitoring on how that cake is going to be cut among all of us. So the system is not failed for success. I mean, I love Paris, but the way that it's been set up is not inherently driving ambition. So we're starting with a design that is not set for success. So each year we're trying to correct that way. This chocolate cake analogy was the only way we could get the US in. And because the US was such an important player at that moment, that was the decision taken. So now we're left in trying to increase ambition in an incremental manner, whereas the Earth doesn't have time for that incremental way. And so every summit from now until 2030 will have to bring climate in, even if we don't want to. It's a human and existential necessity. I've been advising the Maldives in COP26, and so I'm speaking on behalf of the Maldives in many negotiations, and I can tell you, they don't have time. We have 98 months to have emissions. That's 98 months is to 2030.
Thank you. And following up on that, no written rules will matter if they're not implemented. So, Mayara, I would like to ask you, what must happen to ensure transparency in monitoring and evaluating climate pledge to make sure forums like COP and others, as Jimena was mentioning, are not just talking shops?
Thank you, Giovanna. Well, I think we need both. We need more ambitious, NDC as well, more ambitious pledges, but at the same time, we do need those more transparent governance processes that ensure monitoring, evaluation, and implementation of what has been agreed. We know that, as we were saying before, even if every government implemented very successfully the targets that they already agreed, that would lead us towards a 2.7 degrees Celsius increase in temperature above pre-industrial times. So even in the perfect world in which all the promises are fulfilled, which is not what we're currently seeing, at least not for the major polluters in the world, they're still going against that target. But even if they were to follow in the future, that would still not be enough, and all those catastrophic consequences that we talk about would become reality, and they already are. So one thing has already been mentioned here by all the panelists is putting pressure on governance to increase their ambitions. But also throughout this week, we've seen a lot of promising announcements. For instance, a pledge to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. The same, a similar one to end illegal deforestation by 2030, which are both signed by over 100 countries, which is, of course, a very significant step, but we need to remember this doesn't go far enough. As it currently stands, those two initiatives are merely declarations of intent. They are quite broad and generic and do not represent any binding obligations. So in order to be implemented, we need all civil society, but all other stakeholders involved and interested in climate actions to put pressures on government, not only to deliver on that, but also to have more tangible financial commitments and permanent and inclusive and transparent follow-up process. We very much welcome a particular initiative which was announced that there was a collective pledge of $1.7 billion from now to 2025 to support the advancement of indigenous peoples' rights to land. and there was a greater recognition of their role as guardians of the forest, and this is very important, particularly at the time, as we already discussed here, in which those people are under unprecedented attack in several parts of the world. So financial commitment to empower them is welcome, but we also need more clarity on how this money is going to be spent and mobilized, which groups will benefit from it, but most importantly, who will monitor the implementation of such projects. And for that, we need reform in governance and structures. There are a lot of initiatives, and I advise you to also go to the Global Challenge Foundation report, which has very specific recommendations around those reform. If I were to highlight one, which we also address in our report between Plataforma Cipó and Together First, is the idea of creating a civil society champion at the UN system. This is one idea which is aligned with the UN Secretary General's recently launched Our Common Agenda report, and this is something that Cipó, Together First, Global Challenge Foundations have all working throughout the years to make sure that the UN is more fit for purpose, including in the climate area. So we want to see that, and we know we have no ambitions that this is going to solve all the problems of the world, but we think that if there isn't at least one focal point which has a very clear mandate to open up space for civil society, then we're not going to go anywhere, because we need people bringing reality to the room, and those people who are already suffering the effects of climate change, they need to be heard, and that will be our priority for the next years. And Giovanna has mentioned we have a World Future Summit, which we hope that will bring more space for those voices as well.
Thank you, Mayara. I think we need to also talk a bit about civil society and multi-stakeholder participation, which will focus in the next round. So now, speaking about solutions, Linda, what would you say are the next steps for climate governance? How do we address the gaps you mentioned it earlier?
First, I would just like to bring in another perspective also in this, like creating pressure and bridging the gaps. My background before I joined the Global Challenges Foundation, where the focus is global catastrophic risks and broader than climate change. It's also about the risk of weapons of mass destruction and pandemics, etc. And then how governance solutions better could mitigate those risks. But my background is from the private sector, and there I also think there is a very, very clear link between the local and the global that should be thought about, because I think that many of those also alliances of progressive businesses and so on that you see, they are a good, they complement all they are a good addition to the pressure of civil society and the protests and so on. And it gets easier for the governments to also announce more bold targets with this combination of pressure. And also I think it's important to create this link also from the business side. So I would just like to say a few words also about the obstacles that we today see from the business side, especially for those green companies that want to be progressive. I mean, the fossil companies, they will always be like very, very slow and not going in the right direction and so on. But now we see quite many green and progressive companies, but where they lack high price on carbon, for example. They lack clear regulation and laws and so on. And I mean, for example, a climate law, if you're a company in a country with a climate law, that's a much more safe environment to act in as a company as well. So here I think also, and as Jimena said, we have, what was it, 98 months? Yeah. So it's nothing. And here we also have in the report that we discussed earlier, Governing Our Climate Future, we explore the term exponential climate policies. And that is just because we also, from a governance perspective, need to define those key vital policies that also could enable the tipping points for the shifts that we need for companies to be able to scale up all these green solutions. And for example, like risk mitigation mechanisms that also can solve the barriers that we today see that we have. I mean, investments in renewables are seen as low-risk investments if they are in the developed world. And then, like when the financial institutions and so on, like as BlackRock, etc., they say that the same investment in renewables in, for example, the Global South, they put a much higher risk, perceived risk profile and interest rate on this, so they get much more expensive. So here it's so important to create those links, and I think that finding those kinds of key vital policies, but also governance mechanisms that can enable a few key tipping points for exponential change. That's what I'm hoping for.
Thank you, Linda. And I will have follow-up questions to you on because I think it's very important. We need everyone on board, including the private sector. So we really need to talk about that. So before that, Christian, let me ask you about the rule of law. What do you think are the opportunities to advance the rule of law in tackling the climate emergency?
Thank you. I mean, the rule of law is sort of almost a fetish for lawyers generally and international lawyers perhaps also. Are there opportunities? I think, are there opportunities for the rule of law? It seems to me there is an opportunity if the tipping points are realized, if action is sped up in the way that has been outlined, that this will be seen as a successful, late but successful coming together of stakeholders. That's perhaps an unlikely possibility, but that would be an opportunity that under a threat of intense pressure, and despite all the concerns about preserving the largest piece of the cake, states would be cajoled, pressured, or come to their senses and agree on joint, collective action. Now that would be a wonderful example, but of course that is very hypothetical at the moment, and perhaps at the moment not the most likely scenario. It seems to me there's one other point, and this builds on points that have been made by many of you on the panel, which is an often overlooked aspect of the rule of law. Rule of law, we think of dramatic proclamations. Everybody shall be free from torture, clear-cut rules, prohibitions, nobody shall take action. We're having to deal here with a regime where the governance instruments are so much more complex. You've just hinted at it, sort of the private sector is in, but how is it in? Not through necessarily prohibitions, but incentive schemes. And we're talking about very indirect forms of regulations. The same for the state. We're not talking about rules where states agree to a treaty that says, you shall not emit. We're talking about a treaty that is built on cooperative managerial models, where states, first of all, agree in principle to reduce, and then the process we're seeing now, and this is sort of where many of you are involved much more in the detailed work, is one of specification, standardization, bringing transparency in, and gradually bringing in some form of oversight. That's a pretty, if you want, that's the lesser fields of the rule of law. That's not writing a dramatic rule that says there shall be no torture, but that is spelling out what it could mean, how far can you go, how much can you bring states to accept, because it won't happen against the states as much as we would in many fields of international law want that. So this is, if you want, what are the opportunities for the rule of law, you ask. I think it is an opportunity to appreciate how in complex governance systems such as this, so much depends on specification, standard setting, and working out the details, which is not something that lawyers or people giving Sunday sermons often appreciate, but I think where the real decisions are being taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. So let me follow up with you a bit. So I think now let's talk a bit about multi-stakeholder participation. And if you could talk a bit more about the local level and the contributions, like what are the good examples from the local level that we can learn? And then I think, Jimena, you have both member states and civil society perspectives, so we want to hear from you on that, and from Mayara on civil society, and on Linda from the private sector. So, Christian.
Thank you. I mean, in responding to that, I perhaps speak a bit less as an international law academic working in Glasgow than perhaps as a father of two living locally, as it were. I think one encouraging signal is just how, and this is maybe banal for those in the room, but I do think looking at this from a less sort of, if you want, involved perspective, I find remarkable how much the debate has gained hold. So I work in Glasgow, but I live and grew up in Germany. Spent a lot of time in Germany. Germany has gone through an election campaign recently. We had elections 2 months ago. I don't think at any point in the election campaign has there been such a relevance to climate change as a topic. And I don't think any party could ignore it. So I think in that election campaign, whether we're happy with the outcome or let's see what politicians make of it, we have seen social mobilization in action to the point where no party could afford to be in principle cautious. Now that's not true for all countries. I think other countries have a much more polarized, divided debate, but in the German election, which is just one example, I think it's been a given, and it's just been a question of nuancing, or how much do you push, or how much can parties that have been traditionally aligned with coal be pushed towards giving that up faster. But the principle of effective climate change action enforced by constitutional court decisions is not in doubt. And maybe to just end on a more personal note, I mean, my kids, they go to school. For them, it's been an obvious thing that they would go to Fridays for Future marches, which in Germany are the equivalent of the mobilization effort, and teachers would not mind, and it would not necessarily be encouraged to miss school, but it would be perfectly tolerated. Now, a few kids going to Fridays for Future won't change the world, but I think that's perhaps a reflection and a very concrete example of how I think in a country that has not necessarily always been at the forefront, effective action against climate change has been a mainstreamed, accepted principle, consensually accepted by all mainstream parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. So, Linda, is the private sector also giving more importance to the climate emergency? What are some solutions that the business need to facilitate this transition to carbon neutrality?
Absolutely. I would say that it's a big momentum now and movement also in the business sector, both on the side of like new green companies and with business solutions and new innovations and so on, but also actually some of the old, if I may say, fossils, also seeing that they have to change their business models. So I think it's quite an interesting time now. And here I would also like to, I very much agree with you, Chris, with also those examples on the regulations side and transparency side and so on, because, and also those they can look like small regulation steps, but they can be huge. And I did a study that is one of the sub-reports for the Climate Governance Commission on progressive businesses, where I asked business leaders from companies around the world what they see as the main obstacles and bottlenecks for that transition. And here you can see quite clear clusters, where one cluster is very much regarding to competitiveness, the fear of losing competitiveness if they choose more expensive solutions. So here suddenly you also see both, I mean, the more progressive companies that also now are in favor for carbon taxes or carbon pricing. Also had a discussion yesterday with one of the biggest Swedish mining companies in Sweden that has not been so progressive before, but now, since they now have interest in creating green steel with hydrogen, suddenly they argue for carbon pricing, and that's really a new shift. So competitiveness is one key obstacle that must be addressed. The other is this risk mitigation mechanisms, both for handling. I mean, financing is a huge issue now during COP, and here there are obstacles from the private sector that is both regarding very early stages in new innovations, but also for handling this perceived higher risk in mainly the global south. So if we can find risk mitigation mechanisms and so on that can help to canalize all the capital needed, investments needed also in the global south, that would be one tipping point. Then other bottlenecks are, of course, the old infrastructure and fossil path dependence that we have that also needs to be addressed. And then the one with the you said regulation and standards. And for example, the definition of waste is really a hurdle towards the transition towards circular economy. Because today it's seen as more as waste than a resource that we can use again and again and again. So there are quite many, not small, but still viable solutions that could help to unlock the implementation of the solutions needed. And here we need the clear link also to what kind of governance mechanism could help to unlock this.
Thank you, Linda. So let's go to civil society. Jimena, you supported states and civil society, as we already spoke about. So how can multi-stakeholder cooperation truly contribute to keep 1.5 alive?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to order my thoughts, but in a way, multi-stakeholder cooperation is kind of governance of the future, right? We're moving towards a member state-driven process, towards this hybrid approach where you're seeing, for example, in the COP, the two champions right now, one from the previous COP president, Chile, and the UK, organizing these coalitions that bring together countries, foundations, private sector, celebrities into one big umbrella. So I think that the trend is moving towards this hybrid approach towards governance. We're not seeing that in New York at the center of the UN, but we are seeing it in the periphery. And so slowly I feel that that's going to really take hold. But in a way, member states will always have to lead a primary role when it comes to governance and government, providing the enabling environment that was being discussed for this type of collaborations and tipping points that were discussed.
Thank you, Jimena. And I completely agree for the bad or the good. We still live in a world that is state-centric, so we do need member states on board. And civil society is also important, particularly to put some pressure. So how does this pressure, how does civil society participation can be meaningful? That's what I would like to hear from Mayara, from a Global South perspective. And what are the consequences if we continue without it?
Thank you. I think that, as has been said here, I think civil society is perhaps the only actor with the right level of ambition. We are the only ones who, for decades, have been saying we don't have time, we must act. But at the same time, we lack the means of implementation, and often in many countries, even in liberal democracies, they are effectively excluded from those decision-making processes. So in my view, meaningful participation is not only listening to their concerns, although it is important to have forums and invite experts to panels, but this is not enough, clearly. They need to be incorporated in the design and implementation of the public policies and programs that are created to address the concerns that they have already expressed. So we know that climate change is already affecting us all. Like, I think recently this has been very clear. We've seen fires in California, floods in Germany, heat waves in Russia. But obviously the effects of climate change is not felt in the same manner by everyone. In the global south, we are disproportionately affected, and extreme weather events is already killing, displacing, dispossessing millions, and at the same time, inside countries as well, there are groups that are excluded and not heard. In the case of Brazil, for instance, this includes indigenous populations who rely on a healthy environment to ensure their livelihoods, well-being, and culture, but also black populations who, since forcibly taken to Brazil as slaves, they have been historically marginalized, and as a result are the one who make up the majority of the inhabitants of areas marked by high risks of floods, mudslide, infectious diseases, and among many other climate-exacerbated vulnerabilities. So again, this background of unequal distribution of risks and resources, if those people who are particularly under threat, if they are not represented at the table, their concerns will remain unaddressed, both in terms of public policies, but also in terms of funding distribution. And again, years pass by, and here at COP we see again the North and South divides around funding. And while you have poorer nations calling upon welfare countries to pay up for loss and damages, for instance, those same wealthy countries fear that by allocating money to address this loss and damage, which is already taking place in several parts of the world, that this would constitute an admission of guilt on their part. And we, civil society, we know that this admission of guilt is not something to be feared, but something that is necessary to promote climate justice and to ensure that the developed nations do own up to the role that they had in provoking this climate crisis through historically high emissions and through an economic model based on extractivism. So it is fundamental that people are on the table reminding states of their responsibility and making sure that these people who are already feeling those effects on the ground are included as part of a solution to a problem that to a large extent they didn't create, but they are feeling it. So yeah, we need more representation. I know the fact that we are here, both Brazil and Guatemala, it's significant, but it's not enough, and we'll carry on demanding that through our work with our partners as well.
Thank you, Mayara, and I think it's very important to emphasize this. So we have a very easy question from the audience for all of our panelists is, what is the best outcome we can hope here? So who wanna go first?
Happy to go first on the assumption that you'll probably have more profound and more informed answers. Best outcome, I don't know. I mean, talking as a lawyer with a focus perhaps on the governance system, then I think it seems to me that a good outcome would be a completion of this rule book, so the specification of the Code of Paris, which turns the general and voluntary pledges into actionable standards. That would, I think, be, in terms of the lawyer's response, a good outcome. And I think that's perhaps realistic. Then, of course, completing the rule book doesn't say whether the rules are good or not, but I think one thing that's constantly been mentioned, and to which I think many of you have spoken to, is this Article 6 mechanism, the question of the carbon market. In principle, this will happen. Nobody quite knows how it's going to be designed. Perhaps after this COP we know more clearly how it will be designed, and perhaps it permits for effective transfers of capital that has been pledged, and perhaps it permits those that excessively cut down on carbon emissions to benefit from that in an international scheme. That would be one thing. I'll add one further point, and that goes to something that is Paris plus, if you want. It seems to me we're seeing a very broad event in which many things are projected into climate law and governance issues, and that's something that is fascinating about this event to observe, even if you're not a specialist. But I do think what we also see is that almost like two tracks. One is the Paris Agreement negotiations, which are ever more dense and ever more specialized. And then we see, again, purely as a lawyer speaking, all these flanking measures. Debates about whether other mechanisms should be used to harden the rules or make them more effective. A debate about ecocide, a debate about domestic courts turning the nationally, sort of the voluntary national pledges into enforceable action. A debate about sort of, as I was mentioning, a case before the International Court of Justice. And I wish that after COP, perhaps having discussed these things, there was more of a comprehensive action plan that sees the Paris Agreement as the core framework, but one that is in need of these flanking measures, and that is perhaps a bit more strategic about the use of these flanking measures. Thank you.
Great. I'll give my answer in like Twitter format, because I know that we're nearing the night and it's late. So I would say another area aside from what was referred on mitigation is finance and adaptation. We need a lot more money. We need it quicker and more accessible, and definitely a lot more on adaptation and loss and damage. I could get into the numbers, but it's late. So if you have any more questions on the specifics, I can give more details.
Thank you, Jimena. So before I pass the mic to the other side, just to remind the ones who are here with us in Glasgow, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll identify you. So Mayara.
Thank you. I'll be very brief because I think Jimena has already addressed. I think out of everything, the issue of finance is key. We've been talking about it for a long time, and it's been promised is $100 billion a year, which still hasn't been fulfilled, and we already know it's not enough anyway. We need something around trillions. So, but I think there has been some progress in terms of funding for mitigation adaptation. And another thing that I think it's quite good to see here is a greater focus on loss and damage as well. We often look way ahead in the future, but we don't think that the damage is already being caused now. And obviously those people need the money now to deal with the effects that they're already feeling. So I think I'm quite hopeful that this has been a topic that's received great attention here. I know, although I know from a lot of people who also were there in the negotiations that there are a lot of issues unsolved, and there won't be that easy to get any tangible commitment around that. But the fact that it's already become a mainstream topic, I think it's quite positive.
Just before we go to Linda, let me ask you to combine the answer to this question with another question that came from the audience to you about your favorite suggestion from the interim report. The public wants you to pick one.
Wow, that was a hard one. But on the first question, I agree with my friends here in the panel, and also besides what can be a positive outcome from the negotiations, I also hope for more building on more of the momentum that also has been created outside, like in the rest of the world, to keep on the pressure. To also, I think that when we see some progresses and also steps forward, it's easier to continue, and also for like the business side and so, but not only to like have this very abstract promises on like 2040 or 2050, but also fill them with action for the near term, what needs to be done. I hope for that. well, I can't say that I have a favorite because there are so many. I actually say that my favorite proposal for the interim report is to visit the website and explore them because there are so many fantastic contributors and experts and solutions here. So, and both on the long term and short term. And maybe I am a bit more of like also quite action-oriented person, so I also like the action-oriented proposals, but then also the action-oriented proposals can only be implemented if someone has thought about them early on. So therefore, I also very much like the more bold proposals. As for example, I spoke to Johan Rockström, who said that 10 years ago, no one could imagine that there were discussions on carbon border tax adjustments in the EU. But now we are there. So it's also very, very important to have this more visionary and long-term and bold proposals.
Thank you, Linda. So we have a question here. How do we best do this? I think you need to come here because we only have one mic. And because of the camera, right? How? Yeah, so we have two. We turn to the panel to address. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for teaching me more than I've learned down in the blue zone that I felt very disconnected from. Just on the point that you were raising, the momentum is amazing. We did a survey with the UN in 2015. Very bottom. Now I think it's at the top of the agenda. So that's a huge outcome for Glasgow. But my question, looking at institutional structures within the UN to protect the global economy. The wonderful idea which I, from my organization, are things like that useful? Business plan. Because all these things that you're mentioning have come in a torrent in the last few years. Between governance and business. I find that very positive, but is it enough to keep 1.5 degrees within reach? That's the question I hope we were going to discuss tonight.
Thank you, David. Do we have anyone else from the audience? No, okay. So let's turn to the panel. Like about the future, about future generations, because they will be the ones who will suffer the most with what we do or don't do now. So any of you would like to address this for us? And I guess we can connect to your question. How do we work to keep the momentum towards COP27? If you can answer that in a tweet answer, let's do that.
I can talk about very briefly about the question on the global common goods, because that's an issue that we at Plataforma Cipó have been following based on the outcome of our common agenda report. The initial reaction for countries like Brazil was quite negative, as you would imagine. There is a concern of how this concept is going to be framed. Will the Amazon or other forests be considered global common good? Will that affect our sovereignty over it? So it's something that it's causing quite a lot of noise, especially in developing nations like Brazil, India. So I think there's a lot of work on that we need to do on trying to frame this concept in a way that brings those sovereignty concerns that to an extent are legitimate, but also make sure that we have a governance structure in which everyone can work together to protect things such as the Amazon, which has been under unprecedented threat. But I know Global Challenges Foundation is also looking into that, when we hope to be collaborating with them, with Together First, and others. I think Giovanna can speak a bit more about the idea of repurposing the trusteeship council. I know there's a lot of resistance as well, especially from developing countries. I personally don't think this idea going ahead, but it would be good to hear from others also who have been involved in the UN system more about that as well.
Thank you. So, Jimena, if you have a guess on the trustship council.
Honestly, I don't have an opinion on the trustship, but I can speak about the momentum for COP27 that will be held in Egypt. I think that'll be a crucial COP where I would say that adaptation and loss and damage would have to take a centerpiece. So if we start and we get a bold package on finance here, then next year it would have to be being held in Africa. The COP will be, I think, the focus will be on adaptation, and it'll be the perfect timing to discuss that ahead of 2030. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll respond partially to the legal thing, as it was called. I think global commons, I mean, from an international law perspective, not focused on climate change, I think it's a key concept, as you know, of course. Has it been tried out? I mean, I think what would be helpful is thinking forward to think of models. I think global commons in terms of resource regimes, the only one that had a plausible chance of being considered bold and effective was the deep seabed mining, deep seabed regime. That was then perhaps, if the metaphor is allowed, watered down somewhat, but I think that is still the most ambitious. Because we have vested authority in a truly international authority over resources. Now that's very easy, you might say, because it is in the deep sea, which is beyond national jurisdiction. So that won't be replicated. But I think it's those models that would need to be looked at, and there are various ways of sort of where perhaps we can begin to think of particularly protected zones. I mean, we have particularly zones of particularly intrusive regimes in many fields. In armament, where we have disarmament, nuclear-free zones. We have them in many fields with respect to fisheries, with respect to sort of the use of the maritime resources. So I think that's perhaps the way to think about it. But of course, as long as we operate with a model that is based on interstate arrangements, consensus-based, and on the basis of not working with prohibitions, but only with indirect governance tools, that is all quite far away from the current governance structure.
Thank you, Christian. So, Linda.
Thank you. Well, there was one question on, will it be enough or be aligned with the 1.5 degree target? No. I can't imagine that it would be. We will still have a very far way to go. And on the other question on building on the momentum and the path towards, I think there is a great opportunity here to, and it's important that we align the proposals and steps forwards with these upcoming international processes, such as both, of course, the next COP, but also Stockholm Plus 50 that will be held in June, and also in our common agenda process to link and align these. And that's also maybe, I mean, that is also a way to link the local to the global level and to keep that.
Thank you, Linda. So I think now, more than ever, our actions at all levels will tell whether we will break down or break through. I just want to ask before I do a very quick summary and finish the discussion. Do you have any additional point you'd like to raise or any final comments? So just very briefly, I think it's clear from all we've been speaking here that we need a multi-stakeholder and network even that take, the global keep 1.5 UNA-UK, the Global Challenge Foundation, and the School of Social and Political Science of the University of Glasgow for organizing this panel. Of course, our amazing group of speakers and all of you from the audience for your engagement. Thank you.